Welcome to Haunting Vales. I am your host Noah for today's real-based story. What you're about to hear isn't just another urban legend passed around on forums or stitched together from creepypasta. This is real. And if you're the kind of person who believes that evil wears horns and lurks in old churches, you're in for a surprise. Sometimes evil wears the face of a child. This story comes from Clearwater, Florida, a place where the air stays heavy with heat and the nights never cool. The events unfolded in May 2025, and they were buried under silence, confusion, and fear. Buried so deep that most people still believed the official report. A missing child, later recovered. No foul play, no criminal charges, but the people who were there, who saw what really came back, will tell you something else entirely. This story is not just about a disappearance. It's about what comes back in its place. It started on a Sunday morning, a slow, sleepy one where the cicadas buzzed louder than the neighborhood lawnmowers and the sky was already a deep, choking blue by 8 a.m. The Montgomerys were late for church again, but that wasn't unusual. Rebecca Montgomery rushed through the hallway, in a house that still smelled like cinnamon air fresheners and detergent, yelling at her two sons to get dressed. Jason, the older boy at 8, was half wrestled into a button-up shirt and khaki shorts, already whining about wanting to stay home. But it was the younger one, Lucas, who made Rebecca's breath catch every time she looked at him. He had this stillness about him, a quiet that wasn't shy or sweet. It was observant, detached. He didn't play like other kids, didn't run or laugh. He'd sit for hours just watching bugs in the grass or staring at a blank TV screen, like he was waiting for something to crawl out of it. That morning, Lucas was playing in the backyard while Rebecca ran inside to grab her purse. He had his little red plastic truck in one hand and was digging at the edge of the garden with the other. There was a breeze that smelled faintly of salt water and wet leaves. When she returned just 2 minutes later, he was gone. The yard was fully fenced, a 6-foot-high wooden border with a gate that had been nailed shut since the dog died last year. No holes, no footprints, no broken boards, nothing. Just Lucas's truck tipped on its side in the tall grass and a half-dug patch of earth beside it. Rebecca's voice cracked as she called for him once, twice, a dozen times, each time a little louder, a little more frantic. She searched the garage, the shed, even under the porch, as if he could have magically shrunk himself and slipped between the cracks. She called Greg, who sped home from work in under 10 minutes. They combed every room of the house. Jason stood in the hallway, silent, gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles went white. "He's not here," he whispered. Rebecca didn't even hear him. By the time the police arrived, the neighborhood was already buzzing with panic. Helicopters swept over the trees, search dogs barked and howled, and neighbors walked the ditches and trails with flashlights long after the sun had set. But Lucas wasn't anywhere. No one had seen anything. No scream, no sounds, no suspicious vehicles. Just a boy who had vanished in broad daylight like mist in the morning. The official Amber Alert went statewide within hours. Rebecca's voice shook as she gave the press statement, holding up a photo of Lucas where he wasn't smiling. He never smiled in pictures, but where his eyes seemed a little too big for his face, like they were watching you, even through the printed paper. Days bled into weeks. The police interviews grew shorter. The local news moved on. People began whispering theories, abduction, animal attack, maybe even a cover-up. But none of it made sense, and none of it helped Rebecca sleep. Greg returned to work, but he came home less and less. Jason started waking up screaming in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking, insisting Lucas was outside. That he saw him. that Lucas had come back but wouldn't come inside. At first, Rebecca assumed it was trauma, that Jason was acting out from the stress. But then she began hearing things too. A soft tapping at the back door that stopped the moment. She approached, a shadow in the corner of the baby monitor, even though no one was in the room. And the smell. A sour, wet smell like mildew and rot that came and went without reason, strongest in Lucas's bedroom. She scrubbed the walls, called a plumber, even tore up part of the carpet. Nothing helped. And then, 2 months later, at exactly 3:12 a.m., on July 2nd, the doorbell rang. Rebecca jolted out of bed like she'd been electrocuted. Jason stirred in the next room, moaning in his sleep. The house was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. She crept downstairs and opened the door slowly, heart pounding. And there he was. Lucas. Barefoot, covered in dirt, his hair tangled with small bits of moss and leaves. His skin looked pale, almost grey in the porch light. He was wearing the same pajamas he disappeared in. No bruises, no scratches. No, just wide, dark eyes and a strange, hollow smile. He didn't speak, didn't cry, just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist like nothing had happened. Rebecca dropped to her knees, sobbing, clutching him like she'd never let go again. But something was wrong. The air around him was cold. The smell returned. Stronger now, sharp and sickly sweet, like meat left out too long. And when Greg came down and saw Lucas, he froze in place, his face turned white. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked back up the stairs. Lucas didn't talk for the first 2 days. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, refusing to eat. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, almost unfamiliar. He began whispering strange words, sometimes in the middle of the night, words no one recognized. Jason began sleeping in the living room, said he didn't feel safe in the house anymore, said Lucas watched him while he slept. Then the animals started dying. First, the neighbor's cat, found curled up in the garden, eyes wide open, as if it had seen something before it died. Then a raccoon that used to scavenge their trash, found rigid near the shed. Then a dog, a stray that had always followed the boys around, lying motionless near the mailbox one morning. Each one looked like it had died from pure terror. The vet couldn't explain it. Rebecca stopped taking Lucas outside. She started locking her bedroom door at night. Jason refused to be alone with his brother. He kept saying, "He's not Lucas. He's wearing his face, but it's not him." Rebecca tried to dismiss it, told herself he was just scared, confused. But deep down, she knew something had changed. She installed a nanny cam in Lucas's room, hoping it would give her peace of mind. What it captured that first night would never be shown to anyone else. Because what she saw made her drop the camera and scream. Lucas sitting upright in bed, whispering to the air. But it wasn't just that. It was the thing standing beside him, a tall, thin figure with long arms and a face that wasn't a face, just smooth skin where eyes should be. And Lucas was smiling, not afraid, not surprised, smiling like he'd known it was there the whole time. Rebecca couldn't sleep. She sat on the couch with the camera footage looping in her mind, her knuckles white around a mug of untouched coffee. The figure, the thing standing beside Lucas, it had no business existing. Every logical part of her tried to deny it, to erase what she'd seen and chalk it up to sleep deprivation, pixel distortion, maybe even a cruel prank. But the smell still lingered in the hallway, a wet, rancid stink like old meat mixed with stagnant water. And Lucas, had begun humming a low, tuneless melody. He repeated for hours, eyes fixed on nothing, his lips moving just barely. One night she found him sitting in front of the fridge at 3 a.m., door open, staring inside while the food spoiled in the warm light. When she asked what he was doing, he turned to her and said, "It's not hungry anymore," then walked away. Jason, meanwhile, was deteriorating. He grew pale and thin, barely speaking, and refused to sleep without the lights on. He scribbled things in his notebook, pictures of eyes, dozens of them, rows and rows of unblinking eyes with crooked, jagged mouths drawn beneath them. Sometimes he'd draw his family, him, his parents, and Lucas. But in the drawings, Lucas wasn't a child. He was taller, stretched unnaturally, limbs wrong, head tilted at impossible angles. In one, Jason had written, "It wears him like a coat." When Rebecca asked about it, he tore the page out and flushed it down the toilet, shaking. Then the neighbors began to notice. The woman next door, Mrs. Everett, told Rebecca she'd seen Lucas standing in their yard at midnight, unmoving, just staring at her dark window. She assumed he was sleepwalking and didn't want to intrude. But a few nights later, her husband found their dog hiding under the bed, trembling, eyes glazed over. The following morning, the Everetts packed a suitcase and left without saying goodbye. Others weren't so lucky. A man 2 houses down, Mr. Keller, was found in his garage, hanging by a chain from the rafters. The police ruled it a suicide, but Jason swore he saw Lucas talking to him the night before, near the edge of the trees. When Rebecca confronted Lucas, he only smiled and said, "He wanted to see what I see." The thing was, Lucas didn't act out. He didn't lash or tantrum. He behaved too well. He moved like a child trying to remember how children are supposed to behave. He'd eat food but never chew more than necessary. He'd blink, but the timing always felt wrong. He stopped sleeping. At first, Rebecca thought he was just an insomniac, but then she realized he wasn't tired. He didn't lie in bed. He didn't even close his eyes. He just sat, silent, watching the door. Once, in the middle of the night, she crept in to check on him and caught him talking again, to the dark. She couldn't see anyone there, but when she turned on the light, he growled, not yelled, growled. A deep, throaty sound no 6-year-old's vocal cords should have been able to produce. More strange events piled up. Flies gathered at the windows, not hundreds, but thousands. Black, buzzing clusters that thumped against the glass like fists. The power flickered constantly, even during clear weather. The mirrors began fogging for no reason, and when she wiped them clean, Rebecca thought she saw faces, wrong faces, staring back from behind her own reflection, and always that same scent, rot, mildew, something ancient and dying. Every time she scrubbed the walls or opened the windows, it came back. Stronger, like it was leaking from Lucas himself. At school, things were worse. On his first day back, Lucas barely spoke. But his teacher, Miss Harding, reported he kept staring at the class pet, a hamster, and whispering. The hamster was found dead that afternoon, its body twisted like it had tried to crawl through its own ribs. A week later, another student, Jenny Marin, had a seizure during recess. She told the nurse afterward that Lucas touched her forehead and said something in a dream language. Her parents pulled her from school immediately. Rebecca was called in for a meeting. But when she arrived, the principal never showed. His office was dark, and the secretary said he'd gone home early. He never returned to work. He left town that same night. When Rebecca asked the school district for his records, they told her he'd resigned with no notice. The final straw came one night when Jason screamed so loudly the neighbors called the police. He was found in the closet, covered in scratches, eyes wild. He kept repeating, It came in. It came in. It was wearing his skin, but it wasn't him. It had more arms. It crawled. That night, Greg left, packed a bag, said he was going to his sister's in Georgia. He never made it. His car was found overturned in a ditch, miles off course, keys still in the ignition, headlights on. No body. Just deep, muddy prints around the car that looked almost human. Almost, Rebecca stopped going outside. She covered the mirrors. Nailed. The attic shut. She read everything she could find about possession, changelings, skinwalkers. Nothing matched, nothing helped. She brought in a priest, but the moment he stepped into the house, Lucas walked up to him and whispered something in his ear. The priest went pale, then ran to his car and drove away without a word. A week later, she learned he'd checked himself into a psychiatric ward. She called a psychic next. The woman entered, lit a bundle of sage, and immediately vomited onto the floor. "It's not a spirit," she gasped. "It's older than that, older than words. This thing is wearing your son like a costume." Rebecca didn't move. Couldn't move. She watched the psychic's face collapse inward with terror, as though something invisible had just reached through the walls and grabbed her soul by the throat. The woman stumbled back, tripping over. Her own feet, eyes fixed on the hallway behind Rebecca, where Lucas had just silently appeared. He stood barefoot, eyes wide but dead, and the way he smiled, just slightly too wide, like the skin on his cheeks didn't fit, made the psychic scream. Not a loud, dramatic scream, but a short, breathless one, like a final exhale before death. She didn't say another word. She dropped her bag, turned, and ran out the front door, her shoes left behind, as though the house had already started, claiming pieces of her. Rebecca looked at Lucas, standing there, unmoving, watching her. His hands were covered in something dark, not quite blood, not quite ink. She tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Her throat felt dry, scraped raw by invisible fingers. Lucas blinked once, then turned and walked away, back down the hallway, back into the shadows that had started spreading over the floor like mold. That night, Rebecca didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because the whispering from inside the walls wouldn't stop. It wasn't in her head anymore. It had rhythm. It had intention. It was chanting over and over, words she couldn't understand, but which made her teeth hurt and her nose bleed. At 3:07 a.m., the lights in. The hallway dimmed until they were just barely flickering, and her bedroom door creaked open by itself. Lucas stepped inside without a word. He stood at the foot of her bed, eyes locked on hers, and slowly pulled something out from behind his back. It was a doll. Not his, not Jason's. This one had no face, just skin stretched over a blank head with crude stitches where the mouth should be. Lucas placed the doll gently at the foot of the bed, turned around, and left. She didn't touch it. She couldn't. By morning, it was gone. She took Jason and left that day, or at least she tried. She packed a bag, pulled Jason by the hand, and didn't even look for Lucas. As soon as she crossed the front step, every bird in the neighborhood went silent. The air grew hot, thick, metallic. She could feel it in her mouth like copper pennies. The moment she stepped onto the driveway, Jason dropped to the ground, screaming, not like a scared child, but like something was being torn out of him. His eyes rolled back, his back arched unnaturally, and from his throat came a voice that wasn't his. "You're mine. You opened the door. You let me wear your son." She collapsed to her knees beside him, cradling him, sobbing, begging whoever, whatever it was, to stop, to take her instead. Jason fell limp. She carried him back into the house, and as she crossed the threshold, she swore the floorboards sighed, like the house was breathing, like it was content. The next few days became a blur. Time didn't move right anymore. The clock spun forward or backward, depending on where she stood. Her phone showed no signal, no power. The date never changed. The food in the fridge started rotting faster than it should have, and the mirrors in the house stopped showing her reflection. Instead, they showed things behind her. Flickering things with elongated limbs and stitched shut mouths, always standing just behind her shoulder, vanishing the moment she turned around. Lucas no longer pretended to be her son. He stopped answering to his name. He'd walk past her, humming that horrible lullaby in reverse, dragging his fingers along the walls, leaving behind trails of something greasy and black. Jason wouldn't leave his room. He sat in the corner, scratching at the floor, muttering numbers in a whisper that sounded more like static than speech. Rebecca tried calling out to him, tried touching him, but every time she did, he flinched like her hand was fire. One morning, the front yard was covered in dead birds, hundreds of them. Every one of them with their beaks twisted open and their wings bent backward. In the middle of the lawn stood Lucas, arms outstretched, eyes closed, as if absorbing something only he could feel. Rebecca didn't step outside. She just watched him from the window until he opened his eyes and looked straight at her, his mouth moving silently. She couldn't hear the words, but she understood them. He was telling her to stop fighting, that it was too late, that the house had chosen. Later that night, Jason started screaming again, but when she ran into his room, he was asleep, deep asleep, but his body was convulsing, jerking against the bed as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out. She grabbed his shoulders, begged him to wake up, and that's when his eyes opened and locked on hers, and he said in that voice again, not Jason's voice, not a child's voice, but something ancient and wet and deep. You were supposed to love me, but now you just fear me, so I'll make you part of me. She ran into the bathroom and locked the door, breathing heavily, staring into the mirror that no longer reflected anything, but static. The walls began to pulse. Thud, thud, thud. Like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Then she heard it. A knock. From inside the bathroom mirror. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Then a voice from the drain whispering, "You're looking the wrong way." She backed into the wall and slid down, shaking, eyes locked on the sink, unable to move. Then from behind her, a cold breath on her neck. She turned, but nothing was there. Nothing she could see. The house was no longer just haunted. It was alive, it was sentient, and it was hungry. The next day, Rebecca awoke in the bathtub with no memory of how she got there, her hands pruned and pale, her nightgown soaked in freezing water that smelled faintly of iron, and something far worse, like stagnant death sealed underground for centuries. The walls of the bathroom were covered in handprints, too many to belong to just Jason or Lucas, and they were small, each one no bigger than a child's palm, but the fingers were too long, too thin, and some left drag marks as if whoever had made them hadn't walked, but crawled or slithered. Her reflection was back in the mirror now, but it didn't move when she did. It simply watched her, head tilted ever so slightly, the eyes too wide, the mouth smiling even when Rebecca was sobbing. She screamed, finally, breaking down into quiet, dry, heaving panic, but not a sound echoed in the room. It was like the house had stolen her scream, swallowed it, digested it. She ran to Jason's room and found it empty, the walls covered in spiraling scribbles drawn in crayon, but the colors were all wrong, none of them from any box she had ever bought. Colors that shimmered and moved when she stared too long, hues that weren't supposed to exist in this reality. The words, "I'm inside," had been scrawled in the center of the wall in trembling script, written again and again until the words bled together into one long black smear that pulsed slightly when she touched it. She turned, and Lucas was standing in the doorway, expressionless, eyes completely black now, no whites left, just two endless pits that reflected nothing. He said, "Jason's been taken to the belly," and walked away without waiting for her reaction, disappearing into the crawl space beneath the stairs, the place she swore she'd sealed weeks ago after hearing whispers seeping through the vents at night. She followed, not out of courage but desperation, crawling into the dark mouth of the house with a flashlight that barely pierced the dense blackness, the air so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Everything smelled like rust and old milk, and somewhere deeper inside, water was dripping steadily, the sound wrong somehow, not rhythmic, more like breathing with phlegm caught in the lungs. As she crawled forward, the space began to change. The walls pressed tighter, the wood turning slick, moist, as though the house itself was alive and exhaling against her skin, and soon the floor turned to dirt, but not normal dirt. It was soft, pulsing slightly beneath her weight, as if it resented her presence, as if it might swallow her whole if she stopped moving. Then the flashlight began to flicker, and in its brief flashes she saw writing on the walls, scratched in deep gouges into wood and stone alike, languages that twisted her stomach just to glimpse, some of the symbols vibrating slightly even. After the light moved away, as though the knowledge they contained was alive, awake, and watching. And that's when she heard the humming again. Not Lucas's voice this time, but something deeper, older, resonating with such intensity that her bones felt soft inside her body. The sound wasn't being sung, it was being thought, pushed into her skull like a parasite, burrowing through her eardrums. She tried to turn back, but couldn't. The tunnel had shifted, narrowing behind her, breathing in and out like a throat, and all she could do was crawl forward toward the sound, toward the damp stench of meat and rot and electricity. Finally, she emerged into a space she didn't recognize, far beneath the house, a chamber hollowed out by something not human, the walls ribbed and wet like the inside of a body, with roots hanging from the ceiling that twitched slightly as if they sensed her heat. In the center of the room there was a pit, and in that pit she saw Jason, eyes rolled back, limbs stiff, floating inches above the ground as if held by invisible strings, his body twitching in small, unnatural spasms as though it was trying to reject whatever had entered it. Lucas stood beside the pit, humming louder now, arms outstretched, his voice reverberating off the walls like a ritual. Rebecca screamed his name, begged him to stop, but he didn't acknowledge her. He wasn't there anymore, not really. And that's when something rose from the pit, something massive and skeletal and wrong, too many joints, skin that shimmered like oil, a head that was all mouth and no eyes, the sound it made like a choir of children screaming in reverse. And when it looked at her, because she knew somehow it did, it felt like her entire existence unraveled, like every moment of her life was being rewritten from the inside out by something that had existed long before the idea of time. She ran, not knowing how, just moving blindly back through the crawl space, hearing the walls weep and shriek as she passed, until she burst into the hallway again, covered in black filth and her own tears, the house now buzzing with low frequency, sounds that rattled the windows and shook the lights in their fixtures. Everything was bleeding, the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards, all leaking the same thick, black substance. And somewhere upstairs, Lucas laughed, not like a boy, but like something trying to imitate joy for the first time and failing horribly. The next 72 hours bled together. Time had no meaning. Rebecca would fall asleep and wake up in rooms she hadn't entered, sometimes in different clothes, sometimes not in clothes at all, always with dirt under her nails and bruises on her arms she didn't remember receiving. The television turned on by itself, showing static, and within the static were eyes, hundreds of them, blinking in unison, watching her silently as she sobbed into her hands. Outside, the world had stopped responding. The sky was always grey, no birds, no wind, no sound beyond the humming that never left her ears, and the neighbours' houses stood like tombs, windows black, doors slightly open, inviting her to come, see what they'd become. But she didn't dare leave, not because she couldn't, but because she knew now the house wouldn't let her return. It had made a deal with something old and cruel and hungry, and Rebecca was part of the payment. Jason hadn't spoken in days, and Lucas, well, Lucas wasn't Lucas anymore, not even pretending to be. He whispered things to her now in the voice of her dead mother, in the voice of her high school boyfriend who had drowned, in the voice of her own unborn child, from the miscarriage she never told anyone about, using their memories like weapons to break her down. And then came the knocking again. Always 3 knocks, always from the wrong side of wherever she stood, in the fridge, behind the TV, beneath the bed, and once, from inside her own mouth, when she opened it to scream, something knocked back against her teeth, and her vision went black for hours. When she woke, Lucas was sitting on her chest, smiling wide, whispering, "It's almost ready. The door is so wide now, you opened it and didn't even notice. And now we're inside the world. The real one, not that pretend place you used to live." She slapped him, not thinking, not realizing until it was too late that this thing in it. Her son's skin didn't care about pain. It tilted its head, grinned wider, and said, "That was your last kindness." That night, the walls split open, and she saw what was growing inside them. Faces, screaming faces, eyes wide with terror, mouths opened in endless silent cries, all stretching and pulsing within the drywall like tumors of regret, like the souls of those who had come before and failed to leave. She no longer slept. She no longer ate. She only waited, because she knew what was coming next. It had whispered to her in her dreams, in the folds of her eyelids when she dared to close her eyes for even a blink. It said the world above was a mask, and the mask was slipping, that all she had once believed to be real, sunlight, time, love, even sanity, were illusions layered over something cold and formless. And now that she'd peeled back the skin of her reality, it wouldn't let her sew it closed again. The lights in the house flickered constantly, but not at random. It was rhythmic, intentional, like code or breathing, like a heart no longer, human beating beneath the floorboards. The hum had grown into something worse, a melody that didn't belong in this dimension, something that wrapped around her bones and made them ache, something she could feel in the back of her teeth. Lucas, or the thing that was wearing Lucas, no longer pretended. He sat in the corner of rooms, whispering in dead languages, eyes rolled back into his head, his neck bending in impossible ways as if his spine had become fluid, his small frame twitching to rhythms she couldn't hear but felt in her pulse. And Jason, oh, her sweet Jason, he was speaking again, But it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, fragmented, as if multiple voices were taking turns within his throat, a chorus of old souls trapped within a fragile, trembling child's shell. He told her things, names of places she'd never heard of but somehow recognized, events that hadn't happened yet. He told her about the river of teeth beneath the city, about the day the sky would bleed, about the hunger that would crawl up from the basements of the earth and feast on the living. He told her the name of the thing that now lived inside her son. She could not pronounce it. Her mouth refused to form the syllables. When she tried, her tongue stiffened and her vision bled red. And then Jason laughed like a dying dog. The mirrors were gone now, every one of them, shattered in the night, and not by accident. She had heard it, the slow, deliberate cracking of glass, one by one, as if someone or something was walking through the house, breaking their way back into her world. She found pieces of them embedded in the walls, in the sink, even under her skin. Small shards, barely visible, but they moved. She could feel them shift when she breathed. She couldn't cry anymore. Her eyes were too dry. The house had taken her tears. It wanted her dry and hollow, so it could fill her with something else. And the photographs, the ones from the wedding, the birthdays, Christmas mornings, they had changed. Slowly at first. Lucas's eyes looking in the wrong direction. Jason smiling too wide, then more drastic. Rebecca missing entirely. A figure standing in her place, tall and shadowed, mouth like an open wound, hands too long. And then she stopped, checking the frames. She nailed them shut with planks. She smeared them with salt and oil. And still at night, she heard the frames whispering to one another. One afternoon, or what she thought was afternoon, the sky hadn't changed in days. Stuck in a perpetual dull grey, she heard a knock at the front door. Not the strange, erratic knocks from inside the walls. A proper knock, 3 sharp raps, human. Her heart jolted with something close to hope. She ran to the door and threw it open. No one. Just the empty porch. But as she turned away, she noticed something new. A box. Small, wrapped in wax paper and twine, no name, no markings. She brought it inside and opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a photograph, black and white, of her house, but old, very old, decades ago. The trees were smaller. The paint was fresh. And in the photo on the porch stood her son. Jason, but younger, maybe 3. Holding hands with a girl she had never seen, wearing a dress from another century. Both smiling. Both looking straight at her. She flipped the photo over, in smudged ink. "We lived here before you. We never left." The box held something else. A small object wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, she found a tooth. Human. Polished and worn smooth. It pulsed in her palm like a heartbeat. She buried the photo. She burned the tooth. But at night, they were back. The photo pinned to her wall. The tooth on her pillow. She screamed at Lucas to tell her what was happening, begged him to give her sons back. He only smiled, pointed toward the attic, and whispered, "It sleeps above us now." She didn't want to go. She knew what waited, but her legs moved. Anyway, the stairs stretched longer than they should have. The air thickened. The smell of mold and bile became overwhelming. And when she opened the attic door, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. She stepped inside. The attic was empty, except for a circle drawn in ash. In the center, a mirror, not broken, not cracked, whole and pristine, but it didn't reflect
Her. It showed something else, a room she didn't know, red walls, symbols carved into stone, and in the center, a mass, shifting, moaning. And from that mass, she saw Lucas step forward.
But it wasn't Lucas, just the skin, draped over something wrong. The thing in the mirror looked at her and mouthed her name. And behind her, Jason whispered, "We're not dreaming, Mommy. We're the dream." She tried to run, but the attic door slammed shut. The walls breathed in. The house sang in reverse. The mirror cracked, but not shattered, just one long fracture down the middle. And something on the other side reached through it. A hand, wet, clawed, reaching. She fell backward, screaming, kicking at nothing, until she tumbled down the stairs, bruising her spine, the pain reminding her she was still real. She crawled out of the hallway and saw Lucas waiting at the bottom, now standing impossibly still, his shadow stretching in the wrong direction. "It will wear you next," he said, with someone else's voice. "And you will like it." Rebecca locked herself in the bathroom. She scrubbed her skin until it bled. She smashed the mirror there too. But the reflections didn't die. They walked beside her now. They mimicked her when she wasn't looking. She once turned away from a reflection only to feel hands on her shoulders, cold, gentle, guiding her back. Then came the night the sky split. Not literally, but in the way that matters. A crack appeared in the clouds above the house, a jagged line of darkness, and from it poured a noise, high-pitched, warbling, like flutes underwater. The neighborhood lights went out, not just turned off, they disappeared, as though swallowed, and the house began to hum louder, vibrating so violently the windows blew out. Jason floated into the air again, eyes glowing, mouth open wide, screaming a single word she could never remember after hearing it. Rebecca fell to her knees, and something reached into her mind, something massive, and it showed her what was coming, the door inside the earth, the opening of the below, the feeding. She saw cities sink, skies turn black, oceans boil, the earth convulsing like a living thing rejecting its infection, humanity. And in the center of it all, her sons, standing hand in hand, laughing in unison, their skin peeling away to reveal the things beneath. And then, silence. Just like that. The power returned, the sky closed, her sons were in bed, smiling, normal. The walls were clean, the mirrors intact, everything reset, like nothing had happened. But Rebecca knew better, because when she looked in the mirror, her reflection blinked 3 times, and she hadn't blinked at all, and the cold grip of dread seized Rebecca's heart like a vice tightening around her ribs. It was a silent promise that the nightmare was far from over. The house no longer just whispered in the dark, it screamed in silence, sending vibrations. Through her bones, pulses that echoed in the spaces between her thoughts. Every surface in the house seemed to pulse now, like the skin of some great beast waiting beneath the veneer of paint and plaster. The floorboards groaned underfoot, but not from weight, more like a warning, a low growl from deep within the foundation. Lucas and Jason moved with an unnatural fluidity, their shadows stretching and twisting independently of their bodies, creeping ahead of them like living tendrils with minds of their own. Rebecca's attempts to touch Jason were met with cold air, as if he was slipping just beyond the reach of reality itself, held together by threads only visible to the house and the thing inside him. At night, the walls bled slow tears of black ichor, thick and sticky, pooling on the floorboards in grotesque shapes that shifted when unobserved, sometimes forming faces that screamed silently before dissolving into pools of darkness. Her dreams were invaded by the thing's voice, a guttural murmur that echoed through corridors of her mind, promising power, escape, release, and the kind of madness that turns blood to shadow. Her own heartbeat became a metronome for the growing entity, each thump pulling her deeper into the abyss that had claimed her children. Friends and neighbors stopped answering doors or calls, their homes darkened tombs, and sometimes she thought she saw figures lurking just beyond the cracked windows, watching, waiting. One night, the air grew thick with the scent of decayed flesh and damp earth, and from the crawl space came a chorus of children's laughter, distorted, high-pitched, as if their souls were trapped in a macabre playground beneath the house. She tried to run, but the rooms shifted around her, hallways looping back impossibly, doors leading to nowhere or to the same place she'd just escaped, and every window showed not the street outside, but a swirling void that threatened to pull
her in. And through it all, Lucas whispered in a voice that was both his and not his, chanting names older than time, weaving curses that wrapped around her like chains made of smoke and bone.
Jason's eyes glowed brighter, and he began to speak in tongues, his tiny body racked with spasms as the thing fought to fully consume him. Rebecca felt herself fracturing, a splintered soul trapped between desperation and surrender, between a mother's love and a terror that could devour worlds. She clung to one last thread, a prayer to whatever might still listen, begging for a chance to save them, to break the curse that had taken root in her family and in her home. But the house only laughed, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls and seeped into her bones, reminding her that some darkness was hungry, patient, and eternal. It wasn't a sound meant to be heard by the ears. It was felt, absorbed, like radiation passing through flesh and marrow, a reverberation that made her joints ache and her stomach churn. Rebecca clutched the stair rail for support, her knuckles white, her lungs struggling against the thickening air. The house was alive, no longer metaphorically, no longer just haunted, but pulsing with something ancient, something with breath and purpose and malice. The wallpaper peeled back in long, wet strips as if recoiling from some unseen force, revealing rotted boards beneath etched with carvings she didn't remember ever being there. Symbols curved and jagged, spiraled and sharp, almost moving if she stared too long. Jason was whispering again. Alone in his room, he sat in the center of his bed with his head cocked to the side like a broken doll, murmuring to something that crouched in the corner, a shadow too thick for the light to penetrate, its shape ever shifting. Sometimes it
had arms. Sometimes it had too many. Rebecca couldn't enter anymore. The moment her hand touched his doorknob, it would sear like hot metal, forcing her to pull away, blistered and shaking.
Lucas, the older one, began drawing again, only now it wasn't scribbles or spaceships or stick figures. It was a sequence of shapes, geometric and precise, interlocked circles around bleeding eyes, crucifixes broken at strange angles, mouths sewn shut with what looked like hair. He never looked up. Not once. He'd fill page after page and slide them under his door, letting them scatter across the hallway like offerings to something watching from above. Some of the pages moved, not visibly, but when she gathered them, there were always more than she remembered, the stack growing each night like the drawings were being birthed from the walls themselves. One evening, as dusk melted into a sickly grey twilight, she heard it again, that laugh, low and resonant, echoing up from the vents and under the floorboards, vibrating through the plumbing. Every drain gurgled in unison. Every pipe sang with something not quite mechanical, not quite alive. Then came the knocking, not at the doors, but from inside the walls. Slow, rhythmic, like a child playing a game. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap. It followed her from room to room. The light bulbs began to pop, one by one, until the entire house existed in a dim red glow from the setting sun and the flickering blue hue of a TV that turned itself on at 3:03 a.m. every night, showing only static, or at least what she tried to believe was static. Sometimes faces formed in the fuzz, pale and elongated, mouths agape in silent screams, eyes wide as if they could see her watching. She stopped sleeping entirely. Sleep was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. In her dreams, she was back in the attic, standing before the mirror that had shattered weeks ago, but was now whole again, smooth and polished, and showing her not her reflection, but a version of her family that smiled too widely and bled from their eyes. She'd awakened screaming, drenched in cold sweat, heart racing like she was running from something she hadn't yet seen, but always felt. Her body began to betray her. Cuts appeared along her arms, tiny thin lines like scratches from invisible
hands. Bruises bloomed overnight in the shape of fingers, handprints pressing against her back as though something had climbed into bed beside her. And her voice. Sometimes she'd try to scream, to call out for her sons, but nothing would come out.
Her mouth would move, her throat would strain, but only silence would escape, and in that silence she would hear breathing that wasn't hers. The darkness had started to bleed into her. It was no longer just around her, it was inside her. Her thoughts were fragmented. She'd find herself standing in the kitchen holding a knife with no memory of how she got there. The water would boil on the stove, and she'd swear she hadn't turned it on. The fridge hummed with an almost melodic tone, like a voice humming lullabies in a language she didn't understand. Then came the animals, stray cats that meowed at her window with eyes too human, raccoons that clawed at the back door until their nails cracked and bled, crows that perched on the roof and stared without blinking for hours. She tried to leave, packed the boys in the car and drove. But the road turned itself inside out. Every mile she drove only led her deeper into the woods that weren't supposed to exist in suburban Florida. She circled the same stretch of highway until dusk. When she returned, the house had changed again. Bigger somehow, more corridors, a staircase she didn't remember, doors that led nowhere and windows that looked out onto landscapes that didn't belong to this world. Vast deserts under two suns, oceans of black tar stretching into mist, forests made of bone. Something had tethered them. The boys weren't getting sick, they were changing. Lucas's eyes flickered at odd intervals, and Jason now spoke backwards in his sleep, his voice doubling with something much deeper beneath his own. She confronted the priest again, demanding help, but he wept when she told him everything. "This isn't possession," he whispered. "This is occupation." Then he turned to go, mumbling psalms under his breath as he walked straight into traffic and never looked back. Rebecca returned home with a cross clutched in her palm, but it melted in her grip as soon as she stepped through the threshold. The thing inside the house didn't fear God. It had never known him. It was older. It fed on belief, yes, but not faith. It feasted on dread, despair, submission, and Rebecca was growing weak. Something was coming. She could feel it. The air before a storm, thick with anticipation and the taste of metal. The house waited. The boys watched. The thing whispered, and she, the last anchor between her children and complete possession, was beginning to fray. Her sanity hung by a thread, and deep in the floorboards beneath her, something began to crawl upward, not hurried, not frantic, but deliberate, confident. After all, it had waited this long. Each motion was accompanied by a sound not meant for human ears, a slick, wet friction that scraped against the underside of the house like bone dragging over cement. It knew where it was going. It had chosen its path, chosen its vessel, chosen its final moment. The thing that slithered beneath the floorboards had patience as old as time and hunger older still. Rebecca stood paralyzed in the hallway as the sound echoed up through the vents, along the walls, into the ceilings, until it was above her, below her, inside her, her legs locked, her throat constricted. And then Jason's door creaked open.
On its own. He stood in the doorway, small, still, and smiling. Not the smile of a child, but of something wearing a child's skin like a cherished mask. His eyes were pitch black now, pupil and sclera gone, swallowed by the void that lived behind them, yet he didn't blink. Behind him, the room stretched impossibly wide, an endless corridor of red light and rotating walls covered in symbols that pulsed with wet, fleshy warmth. She tried to speak, but her mouth felt sewn shut by fear. Jason tilted his head slowly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then, with a voice not his own, one that boomed and slithered and whispered all at once, he said, "It's ready." The house responded with a long, guttural groan. The floors cracked outward, blooming like rotten wood under pressure. The hallway walls expanded, buckled, and then fell away entirely, revealing a space that could not exist, a grand, endless chamber of black stone and writhing roots that pulsed with heat and moaned with ancient sorrow. Rebecca felt herself being pulled forward, not by force, but by gravity that belonged to this new world. Every step she took was not her own. Her body obeyed something older. She tried to scream, and this time she did. But the sound that came from her mouth was not her voice. It was her mother's, then her sister's, then Jason's, then silence. She looked to her sons.
Lucas stood beside Jason now, his face blank, his fingers interlocked in a symbol that mirrored those drawn into the walls. Both boys stared at her as the floor cracked open beneath her feet, revealing a spiral staircase of rusted iron descending into endless black. A wind blew upward from that hole, wet, decayed, impossibly cold, and with it came whispers in thousands of voices, all speaking in reverse. The boys moved first. Jason took her hand. Lucas followed. They descended together. The deeper they went, the more Rebecca changed. Her skin paled, her eyes dimmed, her thoughts fractured like broken glass. Around her, shapes pulsed in the walls, arms reaching out only to melt away when touched, eyes blinking slowly before vanishing. They reached the final step. It opened into a circular chamber filled with water as black as ink. In the center stood something tall, shrouded, breathing in rhythm with the walls. The boys stepped into the water and stood before it. The thing unfolded, limbs unwinding, jaw unhinging, eyes bleeding light. Jason turned back to her. "You brought us here," he whispered. "You opened the door. You're the key." And then she remembered. Every moment she'd denied, every painful memory she'd suppressed, every scream she hadn't listened to, every prayer she'd abandoned. She had weakened the walls. She had invited it, not with words, but with grief. And grief, is the purest form of invitation. The last thing she saw before her vision was swallowed by darkness was her boys stepping into the arms of the thing, dissolving like salt into water and smiling as they went. And then there was nothing, only a house on a quiet Florida street. Perfectly normal, perfectly still, until the next family moved in, and the boy, 6 years old, smiled wide as he stepped into his new room, because the thing never left. It just waits and waits and waits. So tonight, when the house creaks and you feel something watching, when your child stares too long into a dark corner and whispers to someone who isn't there, when your reflection lingers in the mirror just a second too long, don't look away. Don't pretend you didn't notice, because some things don't want to be seen. They want to be let in, and once they are, they never leave. If you want more true horror, the kind that crawls under your skin and waits, then subscribe. Because the next story might be about a house just like yours.